It's time. Welcome to Spring One again. Isn't it awesome to be back in person? I like the 3D term, in 3D. So welcome. Thank you for coming to my session. I know, I personally want to be at another session right now, right? Watching some of my colleagues talk, so I appreciate it. My name is Spencer Gibb. I am the co-founder and lead of the Spring Cloud core teams. I've been doing that for 9 years since I joined the Spring team, so welcome. Today we're going to be talking about Spring Cloud Gateway for Spring MVC. I'm not supposed to talk for a minute. All right. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about. If you don't know what an API gateway is, we'll do a little bit of background on that. We'll go through our trilogy of gateways that I've built. We'll start with Zuul, move on to Gateway, and then issue 36. And I'll talk a little bit about how things got built, and we'll do some demos kind of interspersed, but main demos towards the end. So let's get some basics of an API gateway. Right, this is a typical arrangement. You have clients that connect over some network, whether it be the internet or an enterprise network or something. You've got apps that they need to connect to. How do we get from point A to point B, right? Well, something has to sit there and do something. Could it be anything from a hardware router, like the F5 or something like that, to HA proxy, Nginx, or something like Spring Cloud Gateway written in Java that's a little more developer friendly. So this is kind of a typical request cycle. Somebody makes an HTTP request, and there are these predicates, right? Somehow my configuration has to match the incoming request, and how do we do that, right? Well, in this case, it could be the path, that's pretty common. Could be the HTTP method get. Then there are some optional filters that run before we send the request down to the app. Once the app responds, we could apply more filters potentially and send back a response, right? This is a pretty basic HTTP request that goes through an API gateway. All right, so let's talk about some Spring Cloud history. Who here has heard of Zuul before? Oh, right. Not the movie, not Ghostbusters, right? Our friends at Netflix created Zuul in the early days of Amazon Web Services, right? They needed something to route their requests, and when I started Spring Cloud with Dr. Sire, he did awesome, by the way, in the keynotes. He was very funny. We decided to bring Zuul in to help as part of Spring Cloud. Zuul is built it's got two ways of use. It could be a servlet or a servlet filter, which meant that this was a thread per request model, right? So you're limited by your capacity of the hardware that you're running on. There were 4 different filter types: pre, route, post, and error. And it was pretty simple. It was just a loop for each stage. Very, very, very simple. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is that there were no batteries included with Zuul. You had to do everything. So this was episode 1, Dave and I building an API gateway with Spring Cloud. Well, Zuul had an awkward API. If you've anybody written a filter for Zuul, yeah, you know my pain, right? Like, return null. I'm like, why? There were static methods, and anyway, kind of awkward. And the only way you could match was a path. We didn't have any other options. But people liked it, people used it, it was fairly popular. We integrate with service discovery, with config server, all those different things. So it was pretty useful. one day I was at a conference not speaking so I could think, and if you remember the history lesson we got earlier, right, when they were building Spring Framework 5 and WebFlux, I was at this conference. Netflix had released a snapshot of their code for Zuul 2, and I looked at it and I went, ugh, I don't want to have to integrate all this. This is going to be a pain. So I started looking at the things WebFlux had, and I went, I bet we could do just as good, or maybe even better, a developer experience if we did something on our own. So I wrote about a page and a half with a little proof of concept, sent it to Dave, sent it to my manager, said, I think we should build our own. And they went, great, let's do it. And I was kind of floored because that's all it took. So Gateway reused WebFlux concepts. So we reused kind of the big plumbing pieces that Spring Framework gave us. It's basically a sibling to at controller, right? And we've all written Spring MVC apps or a WebFlux app with at controller. When I built it config first. What that means is I started with, the application properties or application YAML, defining a route, and then how do I get that to, make an API gateway at runtime. And later, Josh Long helped me write the Java DSL. So the developer experience is so much better than Zuul. The routes, the predicates you define and filters are all scoped to the route. It was great. You could match on anything in the request, not just the path. Could be the host, could be a header, could be the body even. It was non-blocking, right? Like the Fiserv presentation, I thought that was awesome, right? Like they do all this non-blocking stuff, perfect for a gateway because the resources that you consume, you can run on a fairly tight set of resources. I mentioned the flexible routing already. So there are cons, right? There's pros and cons to everything. Some things are complex in Spring Cloud Gateway. Part of that is WebFlux in general, right? Project Reactor. I mean, has anyone here ever struggled to do anything with Reactor or WebFlux? Yeah, okay. When Dave Sire says, hey, I don't understand this thing, I feel like, oh, good, it's not just the PhD in astrophysics doesn't understand either. Great. And currently we require Netty, not just the Netty client, but the Netty server. So currently Spring Cloud Gateway only runs on Netty. We should be able to fix that so we can run on Tomcat or Jetty, but currently it requires Netty. So this brings us to issue 36, not order 66, issue 36. It's quite old, right? I've been doing this for 9 years, and this issue was 6 years old. Hey, Ryan. My boss just walked in the room. So it's the most voted issue I've ever seen in Spring Cloud. So people obviously wanted to be able to continue to have an API gateway in Spring MVC. We heard about Project Loom today, right, in the keynotes, virtual threads. So one talk that didn't get mentioned is Mark Thomas will be speaking later today in this room, actually, about preparing your Spring applications for Loom, right? So if you want more nitty-gritty on the Loom side of things, come to that talk. But because of this combining of events, right? We have Loom coming, these lightweight threads, right? They're abstracted away from the OS threads. It was preview, and earlier when we met as a team in December, we were like, when we found out it was going to graduate, we were like, yes, maybe this is the opportunity now to build an MVC-based gateway, because now we're freed from the thread per request, the OS thread per request, right? Now we can use the virtual threads to get some more throughput. So as we saw in the keynote, we have support coming in Spring Framework 6.1 and Spring Boot 3.2. I think my October date's wrong there. I saw GA in November for Spring Framework. And then So let's go. Let's build something. So just to get a baseline here, at the end on my last slide, there is a GitHub repository that I forgot to make public before this talk. I will do it as soon as we're done. But you'll have the link. So we start with Spring Boot 3.2, the first milestone, and Spring Boot Starter Web. So this gives us Tomcat. We're running on Java 21. And then all I need to do is that one simple thing, enable virtual threads, right? So these are the things set it up for Gateway MVC. So there's not anything in my code so far that actually does anything specifically with virtual threads. It's all going to be set up at the Tomcat level, Spring Framework, and Spring Boot level, right? And it will just enable it so that you can get that efficiency for Spring Cloud Gateway. Okay? So, episode 3, right? We're under construction. So this is the third time. I remember when I was talking about Spring Cloud Gateway, I was like, you should never write your own gateway. Somebody asked me, well, so why did you? It's like, well, I've written one before with Zuul, and now this is the third time. That's a pretty small group of people that have written multiple API gateways. And it's not WebFlux, right? I wanted we needed it to be able to run on Spring MVC. So I don't know if anyone's ever heard this concept before. I think I've heard it in the context of Git, right? Porcelain versus plumbing. So Spring MVC, the gateway for Spring MVC, I wanted to reuse more of framework. So with WebFlux, I used the plumbing, right? Sibling of at controller, I wrote my own handler mapping. In this case, I didn't want to go to that level. Well, it's awesome because there's this thing that my colleague Aryan wrote, called webmvc.fn, right? So this is a functional version of Spring MVC. So rather than at controller, you have something that looks like this. So there's a predicate, right? In this case, Git, and it's actually ANDed with a header one, but we'll get more into that. You need to pass it a handler, right? Something to handle the request. And you can see that class right below here. And then there are these optional filters, right? So if you hearken back to my slide about the life cycle of a request, we kind of get that here, right? We have the request, we have a predicate, we have something to handle it, and then we can optionally filter. All right, so let's look at that. So I'm going to go ahead. So a couple things. Is that okay size-wise in the back for the text? Great. So here is my application, normal Spring Boot application. And these are just some simple functions, router functions. So you can see there's a DSL, there's this class called router functions that's provided by Spring Framework. You call route, get, right? So we're going to match, basically this is HTTP method get and path /hello, right? And here I just use a lambda to return the body of hello world. You can also do things, instead of a lambda, you can reference a method, for example, or a class and methods. So it's pretty flexible on what you can do. So let's go ahead and run this real quick just to see it actually work. So if you don't learn anything today, here's a tool I'm going to show you. I say this quite often in my talks, but let's see, HTTP. So I'm going to use a tool called HTTP. The terminal specifically. I call it curl for humans, right? So that's the command I'll be using today. Oh, go go away. All right, so back to our demo here. HTTP, I don't have to put localhost, it just assumes localhost 8080/hello. Up here, we see the response, okay? Make sense? All right, so that's just a super simple demo of webmvc.fn, right? This is the thing I'm gonna be building on top of. So back to the presentation. So there's an existing DSL, right? That is in framework. You saw that there's a route method on router functions that has a bunch of request predicates attached to it. There's a bunch of, you can start with get, post, patch, whatever. You could do just path. There's also header that you could match on. And then you can do Boolean logic with them. So in case you can compose them in any way that you want, which is really flexible. And I was like, yes, I already have the DSL. I don't have to create my own, which I did in WebFlux. And you can also write custom predicates, custom filters, and that's pretty much how I wrote the gateway for Spring MVC. So there's an interesting concept in the DSL that I'll show you of before and after filters. Basically, I mean, they're self-explanatory, right? Befores run just on the requests, and afters run on the response, okay? And another thing that you can do with this DSL is nested routes. So I've had users say, we have thousands of routes, and there are sometimes performance problems when there are thousands of routes. It's like, why do you have thousands of routes? But if you have that large amount of routes and some of them share a path, you can short circuit looking through every other route configuration by matching on the sub path, for example. So it's pretty slick. I'll show you that in a demo too. So what were my goals in building this? So I wanted things to be explicit versus implicit. In Gateway for WebFlux, there are global filters that are applied, and sometimes they check the requests and say what's going on, and so there's some bit of things happening behind the scenes that just happen automatically, and if you didn't know, they might bite you. DSL first. So I wanted to do the Java side first, and then see if I could add compatibility for the format of the Gateway WebFlux configuration. I wanted simplicity, right? WebFlux and Project Reactor can be complex. I wanted to try and make this simpler. So one of the things I also wanted to do was use the new REST client. So Cora demoed that, right? So this is the thing in WebFlux or in Gateway MVC that is making the HTTP requests. So in one of the Java versions, they introduced an HTTP client, and we also use that by default rather than URL connection by default in the MVC gateway. But you can use Apache, you can use OKHTTP, Jetty, just some configuration is all that's needed. So why might you want to use this versus the one in WebFlux? So there are lots of people talked about organizational requirements. We can, our org doesn't want to use WebFlux. We're mandated to use servlets and hence Spring MVC, right? That's the number one I heard. Next, slightly less restrictive, we only support Tomcat. We only support Jetty or something like that. Another one is you can no longer embed Spring Cloud Gateway in an existing app. So one of the things that people did with Zuul was embed it in like their front-end app or something like that, so you didn't have to deal with cores or any cross-origin stuff because all your requests came into your app, even if they weren't going to be served by your app, right? You just forward it on to the right place. So we lost that, but we're getting it back. And again, simplicity. if some of the things you're trying to do in Gateway are too complex, maybe this will make things simpler. In fact, when I had a checklist of big things that I needed to get done, and I needed to make sure that post worked, right? I could send a body through this gateway. And of course, it didn't because I hadn't built it. I was like, oh, this is where it's going to get hard. Well, it was a single line of code to get post to work, right? There's a utility class in Spring to handle copying input streams to output streams. It was a one-liner, and it worked. So that's how much simpler things can get. So some of the things that weren't, I'm not going to guarantee or didn't want to do here with Gateway MVC. 100% feature parity, right? There may be things that don't make sense to do in an MVC gateway that would, and there are lots of little edge cases and all sorts of little things. So it's going to be close, right? Maybe not 100%, but most things, and I'll show you some of the advanced things that we do have compatibility with. Performance. I haven't done even a simple on my laptop to try and compare them yet. Maybe I will down the road, but trying to compare a WebFlux app and I'm sure lots of people will do it, and we'll see how those comparisons fall out. But right now, I'm just doing it to get it to run on with those virtual threads. So this will be part of the 2023 release train. So it will GA later this year after Spring Framework 6.1 and Spring Boot 3.2. We already have a milestone available, and that's what we're going to be using in the demo. I have to write a lot of documentation of it. In fact, all of it. I have to write all of the documentation. I have not written documentation yet. Olga's looking at me like, yeah, I know you don't like to write documentation, but we'll get some good docs for you. My teammate Olga, she'll be on this stage right after me, actually. There are some handler function, more advanced handler functions and filters to write still. So, how do you get it? Start.spring.io, right? We saw this. Currently, you have to select Gateway and Spring Web, and it will give you the right starter for the MVC Gateway. All right, let's go. So, back to my Palm to show you Spring Cloud version we're using. Okay, 23.0.0.-M1, codenamed Layton. Anyone from Utah? All right, everyone knows, spelled differently. It's spelled with an E instead of an A, but whatever. I used to live in Kaysville, by the way. And then here's the starter that gets brought in. All right, so in my demo here that you'll see, I have a bunch of, that's hard to see, isn't it? I can't really make it bigger. Anyway, there's a bunch of classes. Each one represents kind of its own self-contained demo, and we'll go through each one, or as many as I can get in 17 minutes. And it has in the comments, what HTTP commands to run to replicate, to show what's happening. So, before we get there, I am using, so here is that Moritz showed about Spring Boot and test containers, right? So I'm using that. I have a tests application that uses this new Spring application.from method. You pass it the application, and then I also pass this configuration class here. So I'm using test containers to set up HTTP bin locally, right? httpbin.org is a wonderful website if you're ever doing testing things that you can just make a request to /get and you'll see the responses. Anyway, so I set up test containers to be reused, and I also get some information about HTTP bin and put it in the environment here. So that'll be something we notice as we go on. So, all right, our first route, okay? So remember there was a router functions class from Spring MVC, right? Well, the one I'm using is called Gateway Router Functions. The reason I did this was just to do a little wrapper because I'm specifically doing this one right here where I add a route or a filter that simply adds the route ID as a request attribute, which is useful in some of the more advanced scenarios. You don't have to use this, but some of the filters do require it. But you could do it explicitly, right? You could put the route ID on your own. I just made a shortcut for it. But it's the same DSL, right? The same DSL that is in router functions. So we create our first route. It's a get with this path. So then you'll notice here, rather than a local function that we wrote, right, the return to hello world, here I have this thing called HTTP. So we have a class called handler functions that has this HTTP method in it. So this is the thing that does the routing. It will receive the request and forward it on, receive the response, and allow you to use it. So one thing that filter, that handler function needs is it needs somewhere to send it, right? So in this case, we're using one of the methods on the DSL is before. It's a before filter. And in this case, we're using a simple class that reads those HTTP bin environment attributes and creates a URL for me. So that's how it knows to send. Later I'll show you, for example, how load balancer might work, right, from Spring Cloud load balancer. All right, so we're already running, and again, here is my httpy command, super simple. Anything first, and you can see that HTTP bin returns all the headers, and we'll see some of these other fields filled in here in a little bit, okay? All right, moving on. Route second. Nope, not third, second. So in this case, all I'm doing is showing the composability of the DSL predicates, right? So instead of get path, this would be how you do it explicitly, right? There's a route method, and there's a method predicate, and you pass http method.get and path, right? Make sense? Everything else is the same as before. So if I come back down to my terminal, instead of first, I get second. Okay, and you can see the URL that we used. All right. Number 3. So in this case, we are matching a header. And these this is a gateway request predicate class. Okay, so we're starting to get in some of the custom predicates. So in this case, you'll see that this is a regular expression that you can match on. So if I do, it expects b.r, right? So if I do baz, I'm gonna get 404. But if I do bar, then we match, okay? So we have regular expressions that we can use for some of the request predicates. Number 4 is the host predicate. So in this case, we do some advanced matching, ***, which means any number of segments before this, not just one segment, right? It's the same pattern matching from Spring MVC, from Spring Framework. So for this one, so in HTTPy, if you want to pass a header, you use a colon separator, and it just knows that anything with colon separated values is a header. Super nice. We pass my host. And in this case, you can also see the some headers being added for forwarded. So we're trying to be a good proxy and let you know what we did. Okay? And here is a nested predicate. You can see it nicely nested in the DSL, but first, what this means is anything nested, we're going to circuit break, and then we've limited the scope of the functions that are the routes that are available. So we have just the two. Okay. There's 1 and 2, just to show they work. So now we get into something that's a little more complex. We're going to read the body to match. Again, once you start to read the body, you get memory constrained, right? Because you have to read the whole body into memory. So in this case, we are looking for a body that contains the string hello. And it's just a Java predicate. This could be anything you want here, right? So we're going to do a post, and in HTTP equals separated values get added as JSON fields, okay? So if we come back to our terminal, we match post, and then you'll see up here the data that we sent was hello world, and so it matched hello. I'm going to skip down because I want to show some of. So in this one, we are using the host header again, but we're matching. So just like you can do in Spring MVC path parameters, right? You can do the same thing here. With curly braces, you can match in the host or the path with curly braces, and then you can reuse them in some of the filters, such as set path. I'm not going to show the demo on that one. I want to get to some of the fun ones here at the end. So, like I said, we were going to talk about load balancer before. So in this case, we do a route, get, again, HTTP, but then our filter is the load balance filter. If you recognize the LB from, if you've used Gateway before, you could use LB:// your service name. In this case, it's just a method, and you pass it the name of your service. So we have configured the load balancer client with a service called HTTP bin, and in this case, we are statically supplying some values from the Spring environment, right? But typically this would come from something like Eureka or Console or something like that, okay? So we can see that it gets the right values here. Anything load balancer, and it matched. So let's see. So one of the things in Spring Cloud Gateway is a rate limiting, right? And we use a custom Redis Lua script. Well, I didn't want to try and replicate that, so in the interim, a project called Bucket4J has done some great work, and they have a bunch of, I will switch to their webpage really here. They have a bunch of distributed backends for their rate limit API. Hazelcast, Ignite, InfiniSpan, Coherence, multiple Redis clients, MySQL, Postgres, DynamoDB, right? So you can now set up whatever backend you want. In Gateway, we're limited in the WebFlux version. Hopefully we'll add Bucket4J to the WebFlux as well, but for now you get to see that here. So, in this case, we have one request per 5 seconds, okay? Which the other one, we're only limited to requests per second. You didn't have any other time unit available to you. So now we do, more flexible. So if I do it here, just by default, normal 200, but if I do 2 quick ones in a row, the second one is a 429, right? We've been rate limited. And I'm just using Caffeine as a local cache. I didn't set up any of the distributed ones, but it wouldn't matter. They behave the same, the API is the same, which is awesome. Let's see. There's the circuit breaker. I want to show config refresh first. So I wanted to get to the configuration part. So I was able to get configuration working. So here we have, if you've seen Spring Cloud Gateway before, here are some routes configured. It's a little different, as this is a map rather than a list, because you can combine maps across property sources, where a list you can't, so this makes it so you can combine these things. And I have two routes, config route 1 and config route 2. So if I do that, I'll just, show one of them here. Config route 1, and there is no config route 3, right? I get a 404. So if I come in here and uncomment this guy, I do a build because we have to, probably if I was using dev tools, it would probably do this for me, but I do a build so that that file gets copied into the class path. Now I can come back, wait, don't go, what is happening? And let's see, config refresh. So I did the build, we do actuator refresh. We can see that a number of values were changed in the environment, and now config route 3 works just fine, right? So you can now get the same refresh that you had in Spring Cloud Gateway WebFlux. All right, there are a couple more demos in here that you can try. There's retry, built with Spring Retry. So this is one of the places where we won't get parity because we use the retry feature from Reactor. Here we're using Spring Retry, and they're just fundamentally different. You can get pretty close, but they won't be the exact same. Weighted routing, so that you could use to Canary, for example. We have that built in as well. Yes, so it's been a lot of fun building this. I hope to get it to a working condition, documented working condition by towards the end of this year. Let's come back to our slides here. So if there's one that you want to take a picture of, this is it. So that URL is private. I will make it public in just a few minutes. Forgot to do it last night. You can follow me on Twitter, the platform formerly known as Twitter. There, we won't have too much time for questions here, if any. We can go to the hallway if you want, but I am going to be in the Ask the Spring Expert booth today for 2 hours. So if you have questions and you want to go straight to your next session, you can come see me then and I'll answer all the questions you want. You got me for 2 hours. And then Olga and I, Ryan, and a couple others will be at a round table if you signed up. Go see Mark Thomas's talk if you want to learn more about Loom-enabled Spring apps this afternoon in this room. And yeah, thank you very much.